questions. Question orale, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Des communautés rurales à travers le pays.
All across the country, there's a crisis when families are trying to figure out how to pay for increased heating bills. Acadians in the east or Franco-Ontarians in northern Ontario. They use diesel to heat their homes, and the carbon tax will triple the cost because of this costly coalition between Liberals and NDPers. Will they scrap the tripling of the carbon tax so that Canadians can afford to heat their homes? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we have an economic plan that's responsible and caring at the same time. And I'd like to point out a few of the key features of that plan. We've already doubled the GST refund. That's going to help 11 million Canadian homes. We're also going to be sending Canadians who are having a hard time paying their rent $500. We are going to pay for dental care for all children, all Canadian children. We're going to eliminate student loan interest charges for all Canadians.
Finance Minister was out about a week ago saying that she makes a profit off the carbon tax because she lives in an upscale downtown Toronto neighborhood where she can go on a subway anywhere she needs to go or where she can ride her bike. And most Canadians don't have a chauffeur, and they don't live next. If they're a suburban family that needs to take their kids to hockey or school, they need a minivan. If they're a rural family, they need a pickup truck to fight through the snows and carry heavy equipment. The Liberal NDP costly coalition wants to triple their carbon tax. Will they cancel that plan so Canadians can afford to get where they're going?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, let me just start by saying I think I've probably driven more pickup trucks than the leader of the opposition. But we want to talk about the advice that he has for Canadians on the economy and on fighting inflation. Let's talk about his advice that he gave, which was you can opt out of inflation by investing in crypto. If people had listened to him, and I fear some probably did, they would have lost at least 65% of their money, maybe all of it. It's time for him to apologize, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The minister should talk to the people who live in rural Canada today. Those people are faced with $3 a litre diesel just to fill up their trucks. Similar fuel to heat homes in places like Northern Ontario and Atlantic Canada will cost families as much as $6,000 to get through the winter. The costly coalition of the NDP and Liberals have as their solution to triple the carbon tax that those families will pay. Canadians are worried about keeping the heat on. Will the government cancel the tax so that they can do so? Thank you.
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we've already talked about the Conservative leader's reckless advice to Canadians to invest in crypto. It is time for him to apologize. But let's talk about the other elements of his plan. He wants to eviscerate the EI system that so many Canadians depend on. He wants to endanger seniors' pensions. He wants to make polluting free again.
That's terrible.
He wants to claw back climate checks from Canadian families. He wants to deprive Canadian children of dental care, and he wants to deprive low-income renters of the support they desperately need.
The Leader of the Opposition.
False, 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 and false. But let's look at what the reality is on this carbon tax. She says she's going to send out checks that make families like her have a profit from the carbon tax. Well, according to the Parliamentary Budget Officer, which this Prime Minister appointed, in Alberta, the average family will pay $2,000 more in tax than they get back in checks. In Ontario, it's $1,461. Similarly true elsewhere, and in many provinces, there's no rebate at all, even though the federal government is imposing this new triple tax. Will they cancel this tax so Canadians can pay their bills?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I want to take this opportunity to be sure Canadians understand the blocking and delaying tactics of the Conservatives in our Parliament to prevent Canadians from getting the support they need right now. Here's what the Conservatives are blocking and delaying. Our efforts to make housing more affordable with measures like an anti-flipping tax and a tax-free first home savings account. Who would be opposed to that, Mr. Speaker? They're blocking our plan to permanently eliminate interest on Canada student loans. Why are they blocking that, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, they have a majority with the Costly Coalition and the NDP. They can pass anything they want.
That's right.
If they were really going to make housing affordable, they would have done it a long time ago. It's been 7 years, during that which time house prices have doubled. And now, home heating prices are doubling, with costs expected to rise to as much as $6,000 for a single family to heat its home in oil-heated communities like Northern Ontario and Eastern Canada. And the government's plan with the NDP is to triple the tax. Why don't they stop the tax hike so Canadians can heat their homes?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we do have a plan. We have a positive plan which is fiscally responsible and it is compassionate. It is a plan to create jobs and fight climate change at the same time. And here are some key elements of our plan, Mr. Speaker. We are going to permanently eliminate interest on Canada student and apprentice loans. Yeah. We are going to move the Canada Workers Benefit, which supports people who work really, really hard but aren't being paid very much. We're going to move that to advance payments. A family can get up to $2,400, Mr. Speaker.
L'Honorable Député de la Prairie.
The Honourable Member for La Prairie. Mr. Speaker, since the beginning, the Bloc Québécois has warned that Bill C-13 gives a free pass to companies that anglicize Quebec. It gives the Air Canadas of the world a choice between complying with the Charter of the French language, if they feel like it, and continuing to disrespect the French language with no consequences. While Air Canada has made its choice, they're going to keep on disrespecting French thanks to the Liberals. They'll get around the Charter of the French language by using the Liberal loophole in C-13. Why are the Liberals encouraging the Air Canadas of this world to carry on anglicizing Quebec? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I am obviously an Anglophone. But I'd like to reassure my Bloc colleagues and all my French-speaking colleagues in our Liberal caucus that to me and to this government, French is a priority. We understand how hard it is for the Quebec nation to continue speaking French on an English continent, and that is why this government will always support French. The Honourable Member for La Prairie. Mr. Speaker, the Liberals and the NDP are suddenly in such a hurry to pass C-13 that they're limiting debate. That's strange until you remember that Quebec has given the Air Canadas of this world until December 1st to confirm their intention to comply with the Charter of the French language. There are 2 weeks left, and believe it or not, Air Canada, Via Rail, and CN, all champion flouters of the French language, well, they haven't signed up yet. And why not? Because C-13 allows them to get away with it. They're just waiting for it to pass. Is that why the Liberals and the NDP are in such a hurry to push it through? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, our government and I personally have been very clear with Air Canada when it comes to the importance of the French language and the use of French in that company. And I'd really like to reassure all Francophones all over Canada, and especially Quebecers, that we do understand how hard it is to protect the French language and how hard it is to continue to use this beautiful language. We will support you.
The
Honourable Member for Burnaby South.
À travers le pays.
All across the country, emergency rooms are full. And the parents are afraid their children won't be cared for. I spoke to a parent who had to wait 12 hours for their child who was having difficulty breathing. The Liberal government is looking for other problems instead of taking action. Why is this Prime Minister? Why is this government letting children suffer instead of doing something to solve the problem? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I am sure that all of us, every member here, understands how precious our children are. And I'd like to reassure all Canadian mothers and fathers that our children are a priority. When it comes to health care, on the federal side, $45.2 billion, which is an increase in 8%. That will be the increased funding.
Crisis brewing in our healthcare system for weeks and weeks, particularly when it comes to kids, and this government hasn't been there to protect kids. We know that what's going on is terrifying for parents. We've heard really heartbreaking stories. Parents rushing to the emergency rooms with kids that are struggling to breathe, children that have had to be resuscitated in emergency rooms, and parents wondering if there will be any space for their kids in the emergency room. What does this government have to say? What does this Prime Minister have to say to parents who are worried that if their kids are sick, there's not going to be a place for them in the emergency room?
Here, here. Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the Leader of the NDP for raising that really important question. And I just want to start by saying I am absolutely sure that every single MP in this House cares so much about Canada's children. We know they are the most precious people we have in this country. And I also want to say our government understands the challenges our healthcare system is facing. Our Minister of Health did some important work with his provincial and territorial colleagues last week. And let me just point out that the federal health transfer this year will be $45.2 billion of 4.8.
For Calgary, Forest Lawn.
Cancels her Disney Plus subscription to miraculously save Canadians from going to food banks. Her government continues to tax Canadians to infinity and beyond. Proving how out of touch she really is, she goes on Liberal-friendly CBC and says the carbon tax is helping Canadians. Reality is, emissions are up and the carbon tax is only helping her government's greed while cost of heating homes is doubling. Why won't the Costly Coalition axe the tax on home heating and give Canadians a break?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we know what is really out of touch. What is out of touch is to advise Canadians who are legitimately concerned about inflation, to say to them, I have a magic solution to your problems, and to advise those worried Canadians to invest in crypto. But that is what the Leader of the Opposition did. And Mr. Speaker, if a Canadian had listened to him, had listened to that advice, a $10,000 investment would be worth just $3,500 today, Mr. Speaker. They should apologize.
Absolutely.
The Honourable Member for Calgary, Forest Lawn.
The answer was almost as bad as the Finance Minister telling the 1 in 5 Canadians skipping meals not to worry. Just cancel your Disney Plus subscription and everything should be fine. Canadians are crying out for help, pleading for the Liberals to stop the increases in taxes and inflation. They respond by calling them polluters and increase the carbon tax. The only ones getting rich off the carbon tax is her government. Liberals are out of touch, Canadians are out of money. Why won't the Liberals give some relief to Canadians and cancel their plans to triple the carbon tax?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
You know what Canadians need, Mr. Speaker? What Canadians need today is a government that is prepared to support them, a government that is prepared to be compassionate and also fiscally responsible. A government that doesn't reach for easy populist modest advice like investing in crypto, but a government that does understand people need real support today. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, we're going to stick with our plan. We're going to send those GST checks to 11 million households. We're going to send the Canada Worker Benefit to hardworking Canadians. We're going to eliminate interest on Canada students.
Member for Haldimand Norfolk.
Mr. Speaker, yet again, we have more Liberal waste. Fortis, a billion-dollar corporation, was promised $655 million for the Lake Erie Connector project to get electricity cable built. The Canada Infrastructure Bank, which is a taxpayer-funded bank, has never completed even one project, Mr. Speaker. Now we discover 1.5 years later that Fortis deal has been cancelled due to financial volatility and inflation. What happened to the $655 million that the Liberals promised this failed project? How much did taxpayers lose?
The Honourable Minister for the Provincial.
Mr. Speaker, let me begin by congratulating my colleague on her appointment as the infrastructure critic for the official opposition. I obviously look forward to working with her on these important issues. Mr. Speaker, we have a fundamental difference with respect to the Conservative Party. They did not believe that there was a role for the Infrastructure Bank in helping bring access to private capital and institutional investments for things as important as investing in clean energy and greening our electricity grid, Mr. Speaker. We'll continue to prioritize these important investments because we think Canadians are counting on us to do that.
The Honourable Member for Haldimand Norfolk.
It's not good enough, Mr. Speaker. That's not a good enough answer. The project was cancelled because of inflation, which this Liberal Party caused. While Canadians are struggling to put food on the table, this government cannot account for $655 million. It's wasteful spending like this, $35 billion infrastructure bank that is causing inflation. And Liberals are financing it all on the backs of Canadians by tripling their carbon tax. When will this government stop their reckless spending and cancel their plan to triple the tax on suffering Canadians?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I do want to spend a moment talking about inflation and our government's fiscally responsible approach. And Mr. Speaker, I'm going to quote the Globe and Mail. The Globe and Mail is not always that supportive of our government's policies, but here is what the Globe and Mail had to say.
I'm sure the Honourable Member for Haldimand Norfolk wants to hear the answer to her question. So I'll let the Deputy Prime Minister just continue, please, and hopefully we don't have to restart from the beginning, because I'm sure people want to make sure they hear it, but maybe just continue.
So here's what the Globe and Mail had to say, Mr. Speaker, about the fall economic statement. Quote, "It is, broadly speaking, the right approach. Canada has the slimmest government shortfall in the G7 in inflation-fighting terms that has Liberal fiscal policy looking pretty good."
L'Honourable Député.
The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, the best way to help Canadian families with inflation is to leave more money in their pockets and, above all, stop hitting them with new taxes. But no, this government's going to go ahead and triple the Liberal carbon tax. My question is very simple for the Deputy Prime Minister. Yesterday at COP27, the list of the most effective countries in the fight against climate change was published. There are 63 countries on the list. After 7 years of Liberal governance, could the Deputy Prime Minister tell us where Canada places out of the 63 countries in climate change performance? The Honourable Minister of Families. My honourable colleague is talking about leaving money in the pockets of Canadians, but every time we do things to put more money in Canadians' pockets, they vote against it. Mr. Speaker, when it comes to climate change performance, we're putting more money back into institutions where there is a price on pollution. I'd ask the Minister to start over again, because I'm sure the Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent couldn't hear your answer. Please start over. The Thanks again, Mr. Speaker. As my honourable colleague knows full well, there have been a number of times in the last few years where we have proposed things to put more money into Canadians' pockets or leave it there. But unfortunately, every time the Conservatives voted against it, either whether it's the climate checks or better benefits, or there have been a number of opportunities where they could have supported us and supported Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, a member for Louis Saint Laurent. Well, that's extraordinary. They can't even answer the question. If she doesn't know, we do know how Canada ranked. After 7 years of Liberal governance, Canada ranks 58th out of 63 in climate change performance. That, Mr. Speaker, they boasted that Canada was back. It's the same people, more like way back, Mr. Speaker. Maybe one day the Liberals will understand one thing. Taxing doesn't reduce pollutions, but it sure does reduce Canadians' pocketbooks. The Honourable Minister.
Non, mais Gérard. Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, there are limits in terms of how much you can contradict yourself. The Liberals say that we shouldn't be taxing pollution, we shouldn't put a price on pollution, that we shouldn't be so concerned about the environment. But now they're saying that we're not doing enough, Mr. Speaker. We're not. The Conservatives are completely they have no credibility. There are limits to speaking out of both sides of your mouth at the same time.
Calm.
The Honourable Member for Montcalm. Mr. Speaker, right now, pediatric emergency rooms in Quebec are overflowing. Kids are being moved 150 kilometers from home because there isn't enough room for them at the hospital. It's time for the federal government, for the minister, to stop saying that asking for healthcare funding is futile. Ask these parents, ask the kids' parents if it's futile. It's time for the minister to stop his bureaucratic power trip, arrogance, and bickering, and send the $28 billion increase in transfers that Quebec and all provinces are calling for. What will it take for him to understand the urgency? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
A new politician.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We share the concerns of parents and healthcare staff when it comes to finding acetaminophen for their children. We obtained an extra supply of kids' acetaminophen, which will be available in pharmacies and on shelves in the weeks to come to help solve the immediate situation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Jonquière. Mr. Speaker, sometimes the answer should actually go along with the question. The federal government can see the healthcare system is underfunded. Everyone sees it's at the breaking point. Staff are overstretched and exhausted. But what the federal government refuses to see is that they're the ones who have to do more. Quebec is already spending 43% of its budget on healthcare. That's almost half. The federal government doesn't even spend 9% of its total budget on health transfers. The financial means are here in Ottawa, not in Quebec City. So when will the Liberals finally increase health transfers? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Health. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For a long time now, we've been working with the provinces and territories, not just to provide funding, but also to ensure that there's a national vision of healthcare and that the system meets Canadians' needs. Throughout the pandemic, our government has invested over $72 billion in protecting Canadians' health. In addition to an extra increase of 5%, which was already announced, we will be increasing Canadian health transfers by another 10%. The Honourable Member for Jonquière. You know, Mr. Speaker, Quebecers want governments that work together, but the Liberals have stooped so low as to govern by taking hostages. In healthcare, they're holding the sick hostage while they bicker with Quebec and the provinces in an attempt to deny them $28 billion in healthcare funding. In infrastructure, it's the municipalities who are being held hostage by forcing them to submit their projects earlier than expected by March, or they'll lose $2.7 billion. In both cases, it's Quebecers' tax dollars, not Liberal money. Why not just cooperate with Quebec and the cities instead of creating conflict? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I don't think we have any lessons to learn on bickering from the Bloc. The Bloc has looked for squabbles where none existed. We are definitely willing to cooperate with Quebec and the provinces. I had an amazing meeting with the mayor of Quebec City a week ago and with the provincial minister of infrastructure. And he came to Moncton a week ago. We had a positive discussion. We're going to do good things for the people of Quebec.
Number 4, Wellington, Halton Hills.
Speaker, the government has an opportunity to answer a question that I asked twice yesterday. This is a serious matter in the public interest that requires an answer. Who are the 11 election candidates who received hundreds of thousands of dollars funneled through the Beijing's consulate in Toronto in the 2019 election?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to remind the honourable members what the motivation of foreign interference is. It's not to advance any partisan interest. It's to sow chaos, and it is to destroy our democracy as we know it. Our government will never tolerate it. The RCMP and our intelligence agencies are investigating, and Canadians expect us to do the work that is required and take the action, which is what we are doing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Wellington, Halton Hills.
The government's right, Mr. Speaker. This isn't a partisan issue. Both Liberal and Conservative candidates are implicated in receiving these illegal funds. But we need answers, public answers in this House, so investigations can be launched by parties on both sides of this aisle, by Elections Canada, by other relevant authorities. So who are the 11 election candidates who received these illegal monies funneled by Beijing through its Toronto consulate in the 2019 election campaign?
The Honourable Minister for Intergovernmental Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, we're very appreciative of the focus of the Conservative Party on foreign interference in Canadian elections because it's something that we've been concerned about for a long time. The Conservatives have recently decided that this is an important issue, but Mr. Speaker, good news. Our government set up a critical incident election protocol chaired by the Clerk of the Privy Council with the help of Canada's security and intelligence agencies to monitor exactly the kind of situation that my friend has addressed. It worked very well, and there was no change in the outcome of the election, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Mégantic-L'Érable.
Création d'un réseau.
The creation of an underground network of candidates in 2019, infiltration of agents' offices, agents into MPs' offices, pressure tactics on politicians, a campaign to punish Canadian politicians. It's not a James Bond movie, it's real life. The last 2 Canadian elections were allegedly targeted by the Chinese Communist regime. The Prime Minister knew about it. The Prime Minister did nothing. Why? What does the Prime Minister know, and why is he trying to hide it from Canadians? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
As I said previously, we will never tolerate foreign interference. The whole purpose of foreign interference is to destroy democracy as we know it. The agencies responsible, the RCMP and the intelligence agencies, are investigating. We are taking action. We always will stand up for our democracy. We will never take it for granted. And we know that foreign interference is aimed at destroying that democracy.
L'honorable.
The honourable member for Mégantic-l'Érable. We know that the Chinese Communist regime has interfered in the 2021 election and the Liberals didn't do anything, despite the revelations which show that this regime was also massively interfering in the 2019 election. Nobody's been charged or sentenced for this, for interfering in these two elections. Guy Saint-Jacques, Canada's former ambassador to China, has said that the Conservatives several Conservative candidates lost their elections because of the Chinese Secret Services. Mr. Speaker, I'm just asking for one thing. Is there an MP in the Liberal benches who is one of the 11 candidates who received money from the Chinese Communist Party?
L'honorable ministre.
The Honourable Minister. I'd like to thank my colleague for this important question. Mr. Speaker, when it's a question of national security, it affects all parliamentarians. It's not a political question. It's a question of national interest, Mr. Speaker. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, this government has taken restrictive measures to protect science and research in Canada. And more recently, Mr. Speaker, we blocked 3 transactions to protect our critical minerals in this country, Mr. Speaker. We take national security very seriously, like all parliamentarians should.
The honourable member for Nunavut.
First Nations communities bear the brunt of the climate emergency. Today's report from the Auditor General confirms the Liberal government continues to abandon First Nations community, including to prepare for forest fires and floods. This abandonment is costing lives. Given the right resources, First Nations communities can prevent disasters on their lands. When will this government invest in First Nation emergency preparedness so they have the tools they need to rebuild vibrant communities?
The Honourable Minister for Indigenous Services.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the Auditor General for a very important report. In fact, what the Auditor General found was that the Government of Canada is spending extraordinary amounts of money helping people respond to climate change. In fact, what the Auditor General pointed out is that the Government of Canada can save money in helping communities prepare better and have adaptability plans to withstand the onslaught of climate emergencies that all of us are facing. First Nations people are first in line, Mr. Speaker, to the detrimental effects of climate change, and that's why we have to continue, all of us, to ensure that we're ready, prepared, and that we have adaptation strategies.
For Vancouver East.
That is not true, Mr. Speaker. 112 projects went unfunded.
That's right.
Now, according to the Auditor General, the Liberals have spent billions to build homes that Canadians can't afford. What's worse, they don't even know if this money is reducing homelessness in our communities. The level of incompetence is breathtaking. We're in a dire housing crisis. The cold, wet weather is upon us. People are dying on the streets. They are desperate, and the Liberals have turned their backs on them. When will this government do their job so that everyone has a safe and affordable place called home?
The Honourable Minister for Housing.
Mr. Speaker, through our Reaching Home anti-homelessness strategy, we've ensured that tens of thousands of people were prevented from joining homelessness, and others were actually housed permanently through our efforts. We welcome the Auditor General's audit of the chronic homelessness program. We accept all the recommendations, and we're willing to implement them all. Merci beaucoup.
The Honourable Member for Willowdale.
Mr. Speaker, for the last 9 weeks, we have watched the brutality that the Iranian regime has unleashed on its own citizens. So far, 15,000 courageous Iranians have been arrested, and over 350 Iranians have been killed. Yesterday, our government announced its latest concrete measures against the Iranian regime by designating Iran a country that commits terrorism against its own citizens. I'd like to ask the Minister of Immigration and Citizenship what the significance of yesterday's announcement is.
Good question.
Honourable Minister for Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, let me start by thanking the member for Willowdale for his relentless advocacy on behalf of the Iranian-Canadian community. Mr. Speaker, I have joined in the protests and participated in roundtables with members of the Iranian community, and we've heard them, and I want to be absolutely clear. Canada has now designated the Islamic Republic of Iran as a regime that has engaged in terrorism and gross human rights violations. Senior officials of the regime, including the IRGC, who are inadmissible under this policy, will be removed from Canada. Our message to the Iranian regime and to its henchmen is unambiguous. Canada will not be a playground for bad actors, and you are not welcome in our country.
The honourable member for Lakeland.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians can't afford this costly coalition. The more the NDP Liberals spend, the more expensive everything gets. Gas and diesel is over $3 a litre. Families have to find over $2,000 more for groceries this year. Home heating will double this winter. And food bank users, 1/3 are Canadians with jobs who can't afford to eat. When will the Liberals give Canadians a break and cancel their plan to triple their tax hikes on gas, groceries, and home heating?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment.
Mr. Speaker, and as the Parliamentary Budget Officer has pointed out, 8 out of 10 families are better off after they've received the climate action rebate. And the other thing the Parliamentary Budget Officer points out, Mr. Speaker, is that there are costs to climate change. A $20 billion impact to our GDP each and every year. From my home province of Manitoba, Mr. Speaker, we've had two 1 in 300-year floods costing $1 billion each. The Calgary flood, Mr. Speaker, $5 billion. 7,000 people were displaced from their homes, Mr. Speaker. Climate change has a cost. The Conservatives have no plan.
For Lakeland.
So it's clear from that answer that even though the Liberals have actually created this cost of living crisis, they're just going to make it even worse. The Finance Minister actually said that Canadians should cut Disney Plus to make ends meet. She bragged that she lives in downtown Toronto and doesn't have to drive anywhere, even while she's chauffeured around in limos and private jets at taxpayers' expense. She scoffs while my neighbors have to drive to get around and have to choose between eating or heating their homes and barns and shops this week at -28. The Liberals are out of touch and Canadians are out of money. Why won't they axe their cruel carbon tax?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I want to tell you what is cruel. What is cruel is saying to Canadians who are genuinely anxious about inflation. What is cruel is saying to those Canadians, you know what? I have a magic idea that will let you opt out of that inflation. Saying to them, you know what? I think you should buy crypto. And that is what the current leader of the Conservative Party said to Canadians. If Canadians had listened to him, a $10,000 investment would have shrunk by 65%. That is cruelty, Mr. Speaker.
Before proceeding to the next question to the member for Foothills, I just want to remind some of the gentlemen in the audience who have these deep, strong voices that carry. And although they sound very nice, they are very disruptive when someone is trying to answer or even ask a question. Just a reminder, the honourable member for Foothills.
Food inflation is a 40-year high. Canadians are struggling to feed their families. The Liberals' response? Let them eat cake. You can't afford food? Cancel your Disney subscription. I can't even buy a pack of bacon for $13. When fruit and vegetable prices are up 12%, bread 13%, and pasta 30%, the Liberals are out of touch. And it's only going to get worse. You think these prices are tough to swallow? Thanks to the Liberals' escalator, the tax on beer, wine, and spirits is going to triple. Will the Prime Minister give a sober second thought to his new taxes on food?
The Honourable Minister for Families.
Mr. Speaker, it's hard to stomach what the Conservatives are saying because at every opportunity that they could have supported Canadians in need, they voted against it, Mr. Speaker.
Right.
Our record on this side is almost 2 million Canadians, including 450,000 children, have been lifted out of poverty over the last 7 years. We have supported Canadians with the Canada Child Benefit, with the Canada Housing Benefit, with the Canada Dental Benefit, with the GST rebate that has been doubled for the next 6 6 months, Mr. Speaker. We continue to support Canadians. We just wish Conservatives would do the same. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Well, member for Foothills.
So let me get this straight. While 1.5 million Canadians go to a food bank in 1 month, the Liberals' answer to that is triple the carbon tax on food production. We have farmers from across Canada in Ottawa this week begging the Liberals for some sort of sanity and to drop this tax. Thanks to the opposition, the Canadian farmers will get some relief from the carbon tax on natural gas and propane, and they need it. Diesel's at $3 a litre, and input costs are crippling. Liberal taxes are killing farms and forcing families to the food bank. Will the Prime Minister listen to farmers? Will he cancel his plan to triple the tax on food, fuel, and farms?
The Honourable Minister for Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, I have the privilege of visiting farms in my own constituency as a member who represents rural Nova Scotia. And I can tell you the farmers in my own community right now are telling me how expensive it is to deal with inaction on climate change, how expensive it is when severe weather events take down silos, how expensive it is when they lose more than 6 figures worth of crops.
Oh, really? Set them free, Sean. Just let me know when you're ready. The Honourable Minister from the top by special request.
Mr. Speaker, it seems I may have struck a nerve. The reality is I have the privilege of representing dozens of dairy farms. Over the last number of weeks when I've been visiting those farms, what they are telling me in rural Nova Scotia is that the inaction that they see coming from the Conservative Party on climate issues is leading to costs that are unimaginable. And as the Conservatives continue to chide me because they can't handle difficult truths, they don't understand that these farmers are dealing with 6-figure losses that they needed to buy out of pocket to help feed their cattle. They're dealing with damage to their infrastructure. They want us to take climate change seriously, and they need to stop trying to trick Canadians because they know that the policy they've campaigned...
L'honorable...
The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, forced sterilization, and I'm not talking about the Prime Minister who once again has demonstrated his complete lack of courage. No, forced sterilization, torture, arbitrary detention, political re-education. I'm talking about the situation that's happening to the Uyghurs and the indifference of the Prime Minister. There's a genocide underway in China. The Chinese government is working to make a people disappear. We know it, it's documented, and the Prime Minister is looking the other way so as to not displease the Chinese government. The government, will it finally recognize that the Chinese regime is committing a genocide on the Uyghurs? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister for Foreign Affairs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Canada is extremely concerned by the treatment of Uyghurs in China. We are taking the allegations of genocide very seriously.
China at every opportunity with our Five Eyes partners, with G7 partners, at the UN Human Rights Council, at the UN, and most importantly, with Chinese officials directly. We will continue to stand with the Uyghur people in their search for freedom and human rights.
The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, the House of Commons, the French National Assembly, the British Parliament, the U.S. Secretary of State, among others, have all qualified China's treatment of the Uyghurs as genocide. The Prime Minister, however, refuses to get involved. How, Mr. Speaker, can you hope to help fix a problem if you're not ready to recognize that the problem exists? This is what's happening right now with this government and the Uyghurs. The Prime Minister, can he grow a spine, stand up, be brave, take responsibility, and finally recognize that the Uyghurs are suffering a genocide at the hands of Beijing? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, we continue to require that China respect its international obligations when it comes to human rights, and that it answer the concerns raised in the report.
That report seriously. It has raised the possibility of extreme crimes against humanity. We will continue to fight for human rights and the respect of minority rights for everybody in China and around the world. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands and Rideau Lakes.
These Liberals wasted $54 million on their Arrive scam, and they waived the security clearance requirements for vendors and contractors that would deal with Canadians' biometric, personal and health information. And now they're refusing to release the documents and covering up which Liberal insiders got rich. Canadians can't trust these Liberals, and they can't afford the costly Liberal NDP coalition. Will these Liberals end their inflationary spending?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Arrive Can was an extraordinary measure in an extraordinary time. Canadians expect their government to act quickly, and we did just that. CBSA is aware of errors included in public disclosure and has made the necessary corrections. We, as a government, are committed to the highest standards to ensure that Canadians get the highest value for their tax dollars.
The honourable member for Simcoe North.
You should judge a government by what it does, not what it says. And what this government does is spend, spend, spend. Spending is up 30% versus pre-COVID levels, and Canadians are paying the price. Inflation's at a 40-year high, and now next year we're going to spend almost as much on servicing the debt as we do on health care transfers to the provinces. Canadians can't afford much more of this costly coalition, so will they end their inflationary spending?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, the Globe and Mail wrote that Liberal fiscal policy looks pretty good. But let me give you a few more proof points. The day that I tabled our fall economic statement, Moody's, the ratings agency, reaffirmed Canada's AAA credit rating with a stable outlook. It doesn't get better than that, Mr. Speaker. Canada has the lowest deficit in the G7. We have the lowest debt in the G7. We are a very fiscally responsible government.
L'honorable.
The honourable member for Bellechasse, Les Etchemins, Lévis. Mr. Speaker, the Conservative Party sounded the alarm about the coming economic hard times, but the Liberal government is a bad manager. They continue to spend without counting. We have the app, the ArriveCan app, which cost $54 million. The purchase of twice as many ventilators as necessary, $403 million that cost us. Families are suffering. Workers are going to food banks. Young people are camping in their parents' basements. Can the Liberals please stop increasing taxes, Mr. Speaker?
L'honorable Vice-Premier.
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, it's simply a fact that the Conservatives are wrong. Our economic plan is responsible. On the day the economic statement was presented, Moody's reaffirmed Canada's AAA rating. Canada has the lowest deficit of the entire G7. Canada has the lowest debt of all G7 countries. Our economy is strong. Our plan is responsible.
The honourable member for Kings Hants.
Mr. Speaker, in my riding of Kings Hants and across Canada, our producers from supply-managed sectors are essential to our rural communities and for our food security. Our government has promised to make sure that our farmers are compensated fully and fairly after free trade agreements have been signed with Europe and Pacific countries. Can the Minister of Agriculture please update this House on the way that our government has kept its promises? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Minister of Agriculture. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have the pleasure to inform you that we have completed all compensation for all supply-managed sectors. Dairy producers will share $1.2 billion. About $6,000 for an average farm with 80 cows. There's a new innovation program in place with $300 million in funding. Poultry and egg producers will share $112 million in a new program, and producers will benefit from a $105 million program. Thank you. The Honourable Member for Chicoutimi-Fjord. Mr. Speaker, inflation is very, very hard for Canadian families. Some have had to change their eating habits, while others are skipping meals to make ends meet. And yet we'd warned this government that $500 billion deficits in just 2 years would have consequences. The Prime Minister didn't listen to us, and what's worse, he spent twice as much. Will he at least listen to struggling Canadians and guarantee them that he won't increase their taxes again? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I would just like to quote the facts. I just want to talk about the economic reality of Canada. And the reality is that our economic plan is responsible. Canada has the lowest deficit of the entire G7. Canada has the lowest debt to GDP ratio in the G7. Canada's AAA credit rating was reaffirmed 2 weeks ago.
For Mission Maxkey, Fraser Canyon.
Mr. Speaker, things just seem broken in Canada. Costs are skyrocketing, and everything from children's Tylenol to get this leafy green lettuce can't be found on store shelves or in restaurants across Canada. And we all know why. The costs of producing, growing, and manufacturing are getting harder and harder and have never been more expensive. So why won't the Liberals just give Canada a break and cancel their plans to triple taxes on gas, groceries, and heating?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And once again, the honourable member is from British Columbia, where we have seen the most dramatic impacts of climate change in the last year. $9 billion because of the atmospheric river. 600 senior citizens died, Mr. Speaker, because of the heat dome. And talking about the cost of lettuce, we had a major drought, Mr. Speaker, which is why vegetables are getting so expensive. Mr. Speaker, we have a plan for climate change. We're going to build community resiliency. The Conservatives have no plan.
The Honourable Member for Renfrew, Nipissing, Pembroke.
Speaker, the Crossley Coalition's made it a sin to eat, heat, and drive. They've added a tax like that on alcohol and cigarettes that automatically increases every year. With taxes on fuel and fertilizer, they're making food unaffordable. The government's homegrown inflation is forcing children to miss meals. When will this government give Canadians a break and end the triple tax on gas, groceries, and home heating?
Here. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, earlier one Conservative member referred to COP27, where the whole world is gathered, where people from around the world are focused on climate change, what it means for our economies, what it means for future generations, Mr. Speaker. But you know who's not there, Mr. Speaker? The Conservatives are not there. They pulled members from their delegations, Mr. Speaker, and that's not surprising, Mr. Speaker, because for 10 long years they did absolutely nothing on climate change, and every time they went to an international meeting, they received the Fossil of the Year award.
The Honourable Member for Surrey Newton.
Mr. Speaker, many of my constituents in Surrey Newton travel regularly to India to visit loved ones. Some of them are presently in Ottawa today. The pandemic put a pause on many of these international trips. My constituents are now looking to reconnect with family and friends. Would the Minister update the House on what steps our government is taking to make it easier for Canadians to travel to India?
Good question. The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my colleague from Surrey Newton for his leadership and his advocacy on this issue. Yesterday, I announced that Canada is amending the air transport agreement with India to move towards unlimited number of weekly flights. This will increase the option for Canadian travelers who want to travel to India, Mr. Speaker. But I want to say that my colleague and I agree. We would like to see a direct flight from Canada to Amritsar. I've raised this issue with my Indian counterpart. We will continue to advocate for this until we see more options for Canadians. Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Nothing is more important to Canadians than the health of our kids. But right now, children are being admitted to ERs because of a lack of pediatric medicines. Today, experts told the Health Committee severe drug shortages are a long-standing problem in Canada, with hundreds of medicines in dangerously low supply every year. This must change. New Democrats have long called for the Canadian government to create a public drug manufacturer to supply medications people need, our kids need. Will the Liberals finally act to produce life-saving medications here in Canada?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And we share the concerns of my colleague from the NDP, of parents and caregivers about their inability to find infant and children's acetaminophen and ibuprofen. And this has been a really tough cold and flu season for parents across this country, and we acknowledge that. So we secured an additional foreign supply of children's acetaminophen that will be available for sale at retail and community pharmacies in the coming weeks to help address this immediate situation. Our littlest neighbors, our littlest constituents, they're our top concern, Mr. Speaker, and I agree with my colleague from the NDP. A domestic solution is one that will last a lot longer. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Well, unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, the government is making the littlest effort. This was a good question about establishing a public drug manufacturer in Canada. We just came through a pandemic where we saw the government scramble to secure vaccine supply and only succeed at the expense of people in the global south who never did get the vaccine that they need. Now we're witnessing a shortage of children's medicine. We're seeing Amazon charge over $200 for 4 ounces of Tylenol on the internet. There's something wrong with the system that allows that and doesn't allow for the government to push back, which it could do with a public drug manufacturer to produce essential medications when the market fails. So when are the Liberals going to start the work?
The Honourable Minister for Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, it seems that my colleague was absent for a couple of months, Mr. Speaker. There's nothing more important than ensuring the health and safety of Canadians. That's why, Mr. Speaker, we acted. We even brought Moderna in Canada, Mr. Speaker, to produce vaccines. Not for COVID-19, but for about 30 families of vaccines that Canadians would need, including cancer, Mr. Speaker. We got Sanofi investing in Toronto. We invested in BioVectra, Mr. Speaker. One thing on this side of the aisle we understand, we didn't choose that pandemic. We don't know if there's going to be another one, but we choose to be better prepared. That's what Canadians expect from us.
I'm afraid that's all the time we have for question period for today. L'honorable député.
The honourable member for Louis Saint-Laurent is rising on a point of order. Mr. Speaker, I would like to table in this House the COP27 document Climate Change Performance Index, which concludes that Canada